February 10th of 1936. On this day, the Fiat BR.20 Cicogna, or the Stork, took to the skies for the first time. It was Italy's first modern bomber, built for speed and efficiency, but aviation was evolving fast, and by the time that World War II began, the BR.20 was already falling behind. With no better alternatives, it was forced to stay in service despite flaws. Yet, its story isn't just about being outdated. It flew in combat from Spain to China and lasted until the final days of World War II. Only to meet a terrible fate. How did Italy's most promising bomber turn into a disaster? Let's begin. Now, to understand that, we need to go back to the mid-30s, when fascist Italy was racing to modernize its air force. Despite its smaller industrial base, Italy's aviation leaders knew that they had to keep up with their European neighbors, and more importantly, fulfill Mussolini's vision of territorial expansion. The Regia Aeronautica, which is Italy's Royal Air Force, needed a bomber that was fast, reliable, and capable of striking deep into enemy territory. So in 1934, the military laid out specifications for a new medium bomber. It had to reach 330 kph, or 210 miles an hour, at 4,500 meters, or 14,800 feet, and 385 kph, or 239 miles an hour, at 5,000 meters, or 16,000 feet. It also needed a range of 1,000 kilometers, or 620 miles, and the ability to carry 1,200 kilograms, or 2,600 pounds, of bombs. Now, Fiat Aviation took up the challenge, with veteran designer Celestino Rosatelli leading the project. He already had designed some of Italy's best biplane fighters, including the Fiat CR-32, which was a mainstay in the Regia Aeronautica. Now, Rosatelli's design for the new bomber blended modern engineering and traditional construction. The fuselage had a welded steel tube framework, with duralumin skin covering the front and middle sections, while the rear was wrapped in fabric, a mix of materials that balanced durability and weight. The twin-tail design added stability, while the wings were split into three sections, a center section integrated with the fuselage, and two outer sections that extended beyond the engine nacelles. Now, these wings were almost all metal, except for the control surfaces like the ailerons, which were covered in fabric for flexibility. Another innovative feature was its landing gear. Unlike older bombers with fixed wheels, the BR-20's main landing gear retracted hydraulically into the engine nacelles, which reduced drag and improved speed. Not only this, but the BR-20 set itself apart from other Italian bombers of its time with a key design difference. It carried bombs horizontally rather than vertically. This seemingly minor change made a big impact on accuracy, as bombs dropped from a horizontal position and had a more predictable trajectory. In contrast, many other Italian bombers, like the Savoia Marchetta SM-79, or also called the Sparrowhawk, stacked their bombs vertically, a holdover from their original role as passenger aircraft, hastily converted into bombers when the war loomed. Another major distinction was its twin-engine setup. Most Italian bombers of the era had three engines, with one central one placed in the nose, but on the BR-20, eliminating that third engine meant something crucial. The bombardier could be stationed directly at the front, giving them a clear, unobstructed view for precision attacks. This was a great improvement in tactical efficiency. The Cicogna typically flew with a crew of 4 or 5, depending on the mission. This included the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier or navigator, radio operator gunner, and another gunner. Now, while the design was innovative in many ways, it was also a product of its time, still heavily influenced by pre-war aviation thinking, despite its attempts to push boundaries. Anyway, the BR-20's journey officially began on February 10th of 1936, when the first prototype, the MM-274, lifted off for its maiden flight. Test pilot Enrico Rolandi was at the controls, and from the beginning, the aircraft showed promise. Just a couple months later in September, the bomber was rolled out for operational use, joining the 13th Stormo Bombardamento Terrestre, or the 13th Land Bombardment Wing, which was based in Linate Peloso, Lombardy. At the time, the BR-20 was one of the fastest and most capable bombers in the world, boasting an impressive speed and payload capacity. This, of course, made it the perfect symbol for Mussolini's propaganda machine. The fascist regime wasted no time glorifying the aircraft as proof of Italy's technological dominance. To showcase its capabilities, two modified versions, dubbed the BR-20A, were built for a prestigious long-distance air race. On August 20th of 1937, these two aircraft, numbered I-8 and I-10, entered the Istria-Damascus-Paris race. It was no ordinary competition. It was a grueling endurance test, meant to rival Charles Lindbergh's legendary transatlantic flight. But the BR-20A faced stiff competition. 6 Savoia Marchetti SM-79s, which were faster and more refined, were also in the race. To make matters worse, the BR-20s ran into engine trouble. sealing their fate. While an SM-79 claimed first place, the BR-20As limped across the finish line in 6th and 7th. At the same time, the Fiat BR.20 Cicogna was trying to prove itself in combat. While much has been said about Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe and its infamous Condor Legion backing Francisco Franco's nationalist army during the Spanish Civil War, Italy was just as eager to make its mark. Mussolini didn't just support Franco, he wanted to rival Hitler in influence. Enter the Aviazione Legionaria, which was Italy's answer to the Condor Legion, which began deploying BR-20s to Spain in June of 1937. The first 6 BR-20s landed at Tablada Air Base in Seville, and they were ready to take on their first combat missions by September. The Spanish Republican Air Force, relying on Soviet-built fighters like the Polikarpov I-15 and I-16, quickly found itself at a disadvantage. The BR-20 was simply too fast and flew too high for them to reliably intercept. Republican pilots could only watch in frustration as the bombers roared overhead, dropping payloads with impunity. But the Cicogna's impact wasn't just bombing runs. It also became a crucial high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. During the Battle of the Ebro in 1938, the BR-20's superior stability and altitude advantage made it perfect for long-range aerial photography, allowing Franco's forces to map out enemy positions with precision. By July of 1938, 7 more BR-20s arrived, further solidifying Italy's air power in Spain. When Madrid finally fell on April 1st of 1939, marking the war's end, 9 of the 13 BR-20s had survived. Instead of returning home, they were handed over to Franco's newly formed Spanish Air Force, remaining in service even as Spain carefully navigated its neutrality during World War II. The Fiat BR.20 Cicogna wasn't just making waves in Europe now. It was about to leave its mark on the skies over China, too. While Italy had its own imperial ambitions, it was Japan that saw an urgent need for the Cicogna's capabilities. By the late 30s, Japan's Air Force was struggling with outdated bombers like the Mitsubishi Ki-1, a relic of the past that lacked both the range and speed needed for Tokyo's expansionist vision. When Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, or IJAAS, found itself pushing too far, too fast, with bombers that just couldn't keep up. The Mitsubishi Ki-21, Japan's next-generation bomber, was still in development, and something was needed in the meantime. Instead of waiting, the Japanese military turned to a foreign solution, a rare move given Japan's preference for homegrown aircraft. Their choice was the Fiat BR.20. It wasn't just an emergency pick, it was an intentional gamble on cutting-edge European aviation. The BR.20 already proved its speed, durability, and high-altitude capabilities in Spain, making it an attractive stopgap. Japan ordered 82 Cicognas from Italy, officially naming them the Army Type 1 Heavy Bomber, with the I standing for Italy, a clear nod to their origin. Once deployed, the BR-20s were flown mainly by the 12th Sentai and the 98th Sentai, which were operated from Japanese-controlled Manchukuo, which is now northeastern China. Their primary targets were Chinese supply bases, industrial hubs, and strategic cities, locations beyond the reach of escort fighters. The lack of proper fighter cover turned every mission into a high-risk operation. The BR-20 may have been fast, but it wasn't invincible, and flying deep into enemy territory without support often led to disaster. Chinese fighter pilots, many trained by Soviet advisors, were quick to exploit this weakness. Planes like the Polikarpov I-16, though not cutting edge, were more capable of intercepting unescorted bombers. What began as confident bombing runs soon turned into a deadly gamble. Japan's BR-20s, they had another major problem: their light defensive armament. The Cicogna was designed for high-speed bombing, not a prolonged dogfight. Against outdated aircraft, it could hold its own, but against coordinated squadrons of determined Chinese pilots, it was a different story. BR-20 crews often found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered, suffering heavy casualties in the process. As the Mitsubishi Ki-21 finally rolled out, the writing was on the wall for the BR-20. While the Cicogna had been a valuable stopgap, it was never meant to be a long-term solution. By September of 1939, the Japanese began phasing it out of frontline service. Parts were becoming scarce, and maintaining Italian-built bombers in a Japanese war machine designed for homegrown aircraft became an increasing headache. Yet, even after operational use ended, the BR-20 wasn't completely forgotten. The Allies, always on high alert for any aircraft they may encounter in combat, gave the Cicogna a name of their own: Ruth. Now, despite its shortcomings in Asia, the Italian Stork had spread its wings far beyond Europe. While its combat role in the East was fading, the BR-20 was about to make headlines in a very different way. This time not as a bomber, but a symbol of speed, endurance, and fascist propaganda. Enter the Santo Francesco, a one-of-a-kind variant of the BR-20, known as the BR-20L. Unlike its military counterparts, this was a long-range civilian version, built for distance rather than destruction. Its mission? A daring record-setting flight from Rome to Addis Ababa, the capital of Italian-occupied Ethiopia. On March 6 of 1939, a three-man crew, Manar Lualdi, Giuseppe Mazzotti, and Ettore Valenti, took off from Italy, aiming to make their journey non-stop. With the engine roaring and the aircraft slicing through the skies, they pushed the Santo Francesco to its limits, averaging an impressive 250 miles an hour over the vast Mediterranean, across North Africa, and into East Africa's rugged terrain. After 11 hours and 25 minutes of continuous flight, they touched down in Addis Ababa, making history. But the mission wasn't just about speed, it was about making a statement. Along with the crew, the aircraft carried copies of The People of Italy, the fascist newspaper founded by none other than Benito Mussolini himself. This was no coincidence. The flight of the Santo Francesco wasn't just an aviation milestone, it was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of fascist propaganda. Mussolini wanted to show the world that Italy was not just a colonial power on land, but a force to be reckoned with in the skies. The Rome to Addis Ababa mission reinforced this image, delivering the dictator's words directly to Italian-occupied Ethiopia, as if a reminder to the empire of its submission. But grand gestures in peacetime are one thing. War could prove to be something else entirely. Now, when Germany plunged Europe into chaos on September 1st of 1939, launching its blitzkrieg against Poland, Mussolini had a problem. Italy was woefully unprepared for war, and he knew it. The economy was weak, the military outdated, and the Air Force, despite its sleek designs, lacked true cutting-edge firepower. So, for the time being, Mussolini did the unthinkable. He stayed out of the fight. As Hitler's tanks rolled across Europe, Italy just kind of watched from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment came in June of 1940, when France, battered by German forces, was on the verge of collapse. With Britain left standing alone against Hitler, Mussolini saw an opportunity he couldn't resist. He didn't want Italy to be left out of what seemed like an inevitable Nazi victory, so on June 10th of 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain, launching a half-hearted invasion of southern France. But by the time Italian troops crossed the border, France was already in its death throes. The entire campaign was about securing a seat at the victor's table than actually winning anything meaningful. By this point, however, the Fiat BR.20 Cicogna was no longer the cutting-edge war machine that it once was. The world moved on, and aircraft technology had evolved at a breakneck pace. New bombers were faster, deadlier, and capable of carrying much heavier payloads than the BR-20, whose pair of Fiat A80 RC41 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engines were notoriously unreliable. What had once been a symbol of Italian innovation was now outpaced, outgunned, and outdated. The Regia Aeronautica, which was Italy's air force, found itself forced to rely on these aging aircraft while its rivals fielded superior machines. The BR-20 shortcomings became glaringly obvious when compared to foreign bombers like the British Vickers Wellington or the German Heinkel HE-111. Both of these planes could fly higher, faster, and further, carrying significantly more bombs in a single run. And then there was the Savoia Marchetta SM-79 Sparvero, which was Italy's own torpedo bomber, which proved far more versatile in battle. The SM-79 could not only function as a level bomber, but also a deadly torpedo bomber, terrorizing Allied convoys in the Mediterranean. The BR-20, on the other hand, was increasingly relegated to secondary roles. Its once feared speed no longer was a decisive factor. But despite these setbacks, Italy attempted to breathe new life into an aging Cicogna by rolling out an upgraded model, the BR-20M. With slight improvements in aerodynamics and structure, this model was intended to give Italian bombers a fighting chance in an escalating war. But by the time it was introduced, it was already too little, too late. When Italy finally joined the war in June of 1940, the BR-20M was thrown into action during the invasion of France. However, its performance was less than stellar. 5 of the bombers were lost to French fighters and anti-aircraft fire. A brutal reminder that Italy's once formidable aircraft were now vulnerable against modern defenses. What was once an impressive feat of engineering became an outdated liability in the new high-stakes reality of World War II. The world was moving fast, and the BR-20 was rapidly becoming a relic. Mussolini had placed his bets on outdated machines in a war that demanded cutting-edge firepower, and as battle lines hardened across Europe, the consequences of that gamble became painfully clear. Determined to carve out a share of Hitler's expected victory, Mussolini threw Italy into the fray against Britain. On September 10th of 1940, the Regia Aeronautica established the Corpo Aereo Italiano, or CAI, which was a specialized Italian air corps that was created to support the Luftwaffe in their bombing campaign against the British Isles. The BR-20 was chosen as Italy's primary bomber, flanked by 2 types of fighters, the aging Fiat CR-42 Falco, a biplane already struggling in modern dogfights, and the Fiat G-50 Freccia, which was a sleek but underwhelming monoplane. Stationed in occupied Belgium, Italian air crews prepared for their assault on Britain. Britain. From October of 1940 to January of 41, the BR-20s were dispatched on bombing runs targeting Harwich, Felixstowe, Ipswich, and Parkeston. However, these missions quickly exposed the aircraft's glaring weaknesses. On November 11th of 1940, in a disastrous daylight raid against Harwich, 3 out of the 10 BR-20s were shot down by British defenses. The losses were enough to force a tactical shift. Italian bombers would now only attack under the cover of darkness, hoping to evade Britain's growing air superiority. Despite the best efforts of the CAI, the campaign yielded limited results. By the 10th of January of 1941, the battered and bruised BR-20s were withdrawn back to Italy, followed by the remaining fighters 3 months later in April. Though they had inflicted some damage, their impact paled in comparison to the relentless Luftwaffe assaults that had already hammered British cities. The CAI's involvement in the Battle of Britain had been more symbolic than strategic, showcasing Italy's willingness to fight rather than its actual ability to do so effectively. However, the BR-20 wasn't done yet. The Italian bomber would find a new battleground in the Mediterranean, where it played a role in attacking the British-held island of Malta. This small but strategically crucial outpost served as a lifeline for Allied forces in North Africa, allowing them to disrupt Axis supply lines and launch counterattacks. Mussolini knew that if Malta fell, it would cripple British operations in the Mediterranean. At first, the Italian bombing raids appeared to be working. British defenses on Malta were stretched thin, and supply shortages made resistance difficult. The BR-20s, alongside other Italian and German bombers, repeatedly pounded military targets, airfields, and infrastructure on the island. The skies over Malta became a relentless battlefield, with Axis aircraft attempting to grind down Allied defenses through sheer force. But if Mussolini expected a quick victory, he was sorely mistaken. Britain fought back with everything it had, and soon reinforcements began to arrive. The introduction of modern aircraft like the Hawker Hurricane and the legendary Supermarine Spitfire shifted the balance of power. The BR-20, already struggling against British air defenses, now found itself hopelessly outmatched. As casualties mounted, it became clear that the days of the Cicogna as a frontline bomber were numbered. By 1943, the bombing campaign against Malta was effectively over. The Axis had failed to neutralize the island, and the once feared BR-20 had been reduced to a relic of an earlier phase of the war. Italy's outdated machines, its overextended ambitions, and inability to keep pace with evolving air combat had sealed the fate of its air force. What once had been a proud emblem of Italy's aerial ambitions was now just little more than a relic of a bygone era, overshadowed by the rapid advancements in military aviation. The BR-20 had started its journey as a cutting-edge bomber, but by the early 40s it was being outclassed by more modern aircraft, struggling to keep up in a war that showed no mercy to the outdated. Yet despite its declining relevance, the Cicogna still had battles left to fight. In North Africa, the BR-20s were called in to replace the aging Savoia Marchetta SM-81 Pipistrello trimotors, tasked with bombing British Commonwealth forces entrenched in Tobruk, a strategic stronghold on Libya's Mediterranean coast. But Italian industry, already strained by war, was struggling to manufacture enough spare parts and replacement aircraft to keep the BR-20s operational. Italy's inability to sustain its own air power forced the Germans to step in. The Luftwaffe took a more dominant role in the North African campaign, supplying the Italians with the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka and the Ju-88. Aircraft that were far better suited for the evolving demands of desert warfare. As a result, the BR-20 was gradually pulled from the frontline duty, though the 55th Group continued to operate in combat roles, squeezing every last drop of usefulness out of these aging bombers. The BR-20 also found itself in action across the Balkans. It was deployed during Italy's disastrous invasion of Greece in 1940, where Italian forces quickly became bogged down in a brutal winter campaign against a stubborn and well-defended Greek army. The aircraft later saw action in Yugoslavia from 1941 onward, supporting Axis occupation forces as they struggled to maintain control. Some BR-20s even ended up in the hands of Italy's allies, including the Royal Hungarian Air Force and the Air Force of the independent state of Croatia. That's a mouthful. However, in these cases, they were primarily used as bomber trainers rather than frontline combat aircraft, a clear indication that their combat effectiveness was diminishing. And one of the BR-20's final battlegrounds was the Eastern Front, where it was deployed for long-range bombing and reconnaissance missions from August of 1942 to April of 1943. Operating in the vast freezing expanse of the Soviet Union was no easy task. The harsh winter conditions wreaked havoc on aircraft engines. The Soviet air defenses were growing stronger by the day, with more advanced bombers available and Italian air power crumbling on multiple fronts. The BR-20's time as a war machine was running out. Now, as the war dragged on and Italy's air force crumbled under the weight of superior Allied firepower, the BR-20's days as a frontline bomber came to an unceremonious end. The aircraft that had once been a symbol of Italian aerial ambition was now barely holding on, repurposed for roles that required little more than endurance, maritime patrols, transport, and training missions. By the time Italy surrendered to the Allies in September of 43, only 67 Fiat BR.20 Cicognas remained in service. The aircraft that had once been Italy's great hope for air dominance was now reduced to flying routine patrols over the Mediterranean, watching a war that had long since outpaced it. For the remainder of World War II, the few surviving BR-20s were flown in non-combat roles, mostly as transports and trainers. Their once deadly bomb bays now carried supplies instead of destruction. The final chapter of the BR-20 officially closed on June 7th of 1946, when the last aircraft was retired from the Italian Air Force, marking the quiet end of an era. Unlike other wartime bombers that found their way into museums or private collections, no BR-20s were ever preserved. Not a single example remains today. At least not on land. Though the skies no longer hold the Cicognas, the depths of the Mediterranean still whisper its story. 2 documented wrecks of BR-20s lie beneath the waves, serving as eerie reminders of Italy's wartime struggles. One wreck rests off the coast of Santo Stefano al Mare, in the province of Imperia. The aircraft, identified as a BR-20 MM-21503, met its fate on June 13th of 1940, during the raid against the French city of Hyères. Severely damaged by enemy fire, the bomber struggled to stay aloft as pilot Simone Catalano attempted to bring his crew back to safety. But the aircraft's wounds were just too deep, and 2 miles off the Italian coast, Catalano was forced to ditch into the sea. Of the 5 crew members on board, pilot Simone Catalano, co-pilot Ottavio Aliani, radio operator Salvatore Gaeta, gunner Tommaso Ferrari, and flight engineer Ferris, only Aliani and Ferris survived. The others went down with their plane, now a submerged war grave resting 48 meters below the surface, visited only by divers who document its remains. Now, the second BR-20 wreck lies off the coast of San Leone, Agrigento in Sicily. Here, a Cicogna bomber was discovered still holding a deadly secret. Its full payload of bombs remained intact, even decades after it sank. The Comsobin, which is Italy's elite naval special forces, took on the delicate task of safely disposing the explosives, ensuring that they would never pose a threat again. However, this wreck was not entirely lost to the sea. Several artifacts from the bomber were recovered and are now displayed at the Museum of the Landing in Sicily of 1943 in Catania, Sicily. These salvage pieces stand as the only remnants of the BR-20's existence, a tangible connection to a plane that once flew in the heart of battle and then vanished from history, except for those who dare to get deep enough to find it. Now, although the Fiat BR-20 had faded from the skies, its legacy wasn't entirely erased. While no complete examples remain in a museum, the wrecks resting beneath the Mediterranean serve as haunting reminders of its place in history. These sunken warbirds tell a story of ambition, struggle, and a nation's fight to maintain its place in the air, one that ended in the shadow of more advanced machines. The BR-20's decline wasn't just a result of battlefield losses. It's a victim of progress. By the early 40s, aircraft design was advancing at an unforgivable pace, and bombers that had once been state-of-the-art were quickly made obsolete. Faster, better armed, and more versatile planes took its place, and Italy, struggling with production delays and resource shortages, simply couldn't keep up. Yet for all its shortcomings, the BR-20 had its moments. In its prime, it had been a symbol of Italian aerial prowess, breaking records and proving itself in international competitions. Though it couldn't stand against the tide of modern warfare, it was a machine that, for a time, gave Italy wings.